So this video is meant to be a kind of overview of the things we've done already to help you prepare for the exam. I've put the stories in order here. For Genesis and Exodus, we don't have dates. There are some dates floating out there, but we have no verification that these meet historical methodological requirements to be considered historical. And remember that Tillich sees the truth of these stories not to be in their literal historical accuracy, but rather in their symbolic power. So that's how we're going to look at Genesis and Exodus from a symbolic perspective. But just the stories, you just need to know the narratives, and you need to know them in order. All right, you don't need dates, but you need to know them in order. There are some key themes here in Genesis. We're looking first at Genesis on this slide. God chooses Abram in the beginning, makes a covenant with Abraham, hears the cries of Ishmael. God's a God who hears the cries of God's people. And there's this theme of miraculous survival, the miraculous survival of the Israelites with God's help. So we begin with God choosing Abram, making a covenant. You should know the covenant. That's on another slide here. Abram and Sarai cannot conceive despite this covenantal promise that Abraham's going to have children, descendants like the stars in the sky. So Sarai takes it upon herself to send in her slave Hagar, and Ishmael is born. Ishmael is Hagar and Abram's son, though technically Hagar is Sarai's son because Hagar is her slave. We have the first story of Hagar in the wilderness here. God meets her again. This is a very important story. Hagar's story is very important to womanist theology because of the slavery issue, and because God is with the people who are slaves, the people who are disenfranchised. But God sends her back to submit. We don't know why exactly, but God does. We have the circumcision and the name change here. That is, we know that the circumcision, when we have Ishmael is circumcised according to the covenant, and we have Sarah and Abraham are now take on their full names. At this point, we have the story of Sodom, and this is only in here because it's set against the later story where God tests Abraham's faith by asking him to sacrifice his son. In the Sodom story, remember that we have Abraham being an advocate for the righteous people in Sodom. God's going to slay them all, and Abraham talks God down, sort of says, well, is that really fair? And we have this interesting thing where both God and Abraham seem to have this third notion out there of justice. It seems to be calling God to account just as it calls Abraham to account. So Abraham can call God to account on the basis of what's just, right? How far be it from God to do things that are unjust, he basically says, right? Audacious. Abraham and Sarah, who was too old to conceive, now miraculously because she's over 100 supposedly, have a child, Isaac, according to God's promise. So God delivers on the promise as God had promised to do, and promises that Abraham, that this line there'll be a blessing on this line through the child of Isaac. Remember, we're now going in the Hebrew Bible, so we're going to track this line through Isaac. Hagar and Ishmael are sent away by Sarah into the wilderness. Abraham doesn't intervene. Remember, this is when apparently Sarah is jealous of the fact that Ishmael's the elder son, and now that she has her own son, doesn't want Ishmael to inherit, so they're sent away. Abraham gives them a little bit of food, a little bit of water, sends them off into the wilderness, i.e. the desert, where in all probability they're going to die, but Ishmael, as he's crying, they're suffering from thirst. Hagar hasn't been able to stand it. She's put him over a way so she doesn't have to look at him. God, as he's dying, God appears and he says, I've heard Ishmael's cries. It's important. I heard their cries. God hears the cries of God's people. Right? So Ishmael cries, God saves them, produces water, and we know that we hear that Ishmael goes off with his mother and kind of creates another nation, which is going to become Islam. We then have the story of God testing Abraham's faith, the sacrifice of his son Isaac, and here we see Abraham being obedient to God in ways that many people think is odd, because at this point justice doesn't seem to be part of the picture, certainly not from Isaac's perspective. What distinguishes this story from the story of Sodom is not entirely clear, but they are different stories. Different things are happening here. But this is a very interesting thing that Abraham is completely submissive to God's God's will here. We now move on to the next generation. All right, so we now have Isaac, right? We're going to follow this line through Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. They have 2 sons, twins, Esau the elder, Jacob the younger. Rebekah on her own decides to set Jacob ahead of Esau and helps him to steal the blessing from Isaac. It should have been Esau's blessing, but he gets the blessing from his father, who's blind at this point, by pretending to be his brother Esau. Esau's angry, so Jacob runs away to his uncle Laban. His mother, Rebekah, says, "Go to my brother Laban." And when he gets there, he meets Rachel at the well, which is Laban's youngest daughter. And he asks Laban for his daughter's hand in marriage. He falls in love with Rachel. Laban says, "Fine, but you've got to work for me for 7 years to earn her." Right? We have a kind of a dowry here. He's got to pay off. So Laban tricks Jacob, however, after 7 years, by replacing Rachel with her older sister Leah on the wedding night. And Jacob awakes in the morning to discover he's married the older daughter. Jacob says, "Well, you can have Rachel, but you have to work another 7 years." And he does. He weds Rachel, and the 2 women, the 2 sisters, begin to compete. Who can bear the most children? Remember, this is going to replicate this idea that there's something really positive in being able for a woman to be able to bear children. That if you can't bear children, that's considered a sort of, you've done something to arouse God's anger, presumably. And so this is one reason why Sarah was angry originally at Hagar, right? Because Hagar could do this and she could not. But we have the daughters here, the two wives. Notice he has multiple wives, and that's just fine in the Bible. And they both give their slaves to Jacob to have extra children, so they can count those in their notches on their gun. You know, how many children can they make? And so between them, they have 12 sons and a daughter, right? The 12 sons are very important. They're going to become the 12 tribes of Israel, because Jacob is going to be renamed Israel, all right, eventually. There's also a daughter. Now, eventually, Jacob decides it's time to leave. He's also managed to trick Laban. He's a trickster. That's, he's a trickster. And he's managed to do very well with Laban, 2 wives, loads of children, huge flocks that he's managed to cull out of Laban's flock. And he decides it's time to leave. So off they go. He's going to return now home, but he's worried about what's going to happen when he gets there. Is Esau going to attack him and kill his family and his flocks? He doesn't know what's going to happen. So when he gets close, he leaves them behind and goes over to sleep himself. He crosses the river and sleeps there that night. And he has this dream, which I should actually put there, write that in. That should fit into this story here. He has the dream where he's wrestling with the angel, all night with the angel. It's a strange dream. And in the morning, the angel says, "You've wrestled with God and lived, and now your name is Israel." All right, so now Jacob becomes Israel, and his 12 sons are going to be the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we move to the next generation. Okay, so Jacob and Rachel and Leah and all these boys and the daughter. We know that we have these 12 boys, and the older sons are jealous of Joseph, right? Now, Joseph and Benjamin are the 2 sons that were Rachel's. So it's important, the 2 of Rachel's children. And in that sense, this seems to explain why Isaac loves Joseph so much. And later we hear that he loves Benjamin very much too, especially. He gives Joseph the special coat. The brothers are jealous. Joseph has this capacity to interpret dreams. This is much more kind of like the magicians we're going to see in the court eventually of the Pharaoh. He can do this magic stuff. He can interpret dreams correctly. His brothers get jealous. We have this story where he goes up. He's supposed to take food up to his brothers up there who they're taking care of the flocks, and the brothers decide to kill him. But in fact, they wind up selling him into slavery instead. Somebody's headed off down there. They see a caravan headed to Egypt. They sell their brother into slavery. Joseph goes down to Egypt. He does very well, despite all predictions. You can't keep this boy down. He's got the blessing. Winds up in prison eventually. However, after he's sold to Potiphar, the story. And eventually winds up interpreting the Pharaoh's dream and becoming the person who is supposed to save Egypt from the coming famine that he has predicted based on the Pharaoh's dream. He's unrecognizable by the time the famine actually hits. He is by now right up there with the Pharaoh. He's a very important person. He's 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. This famine covers all of the area, and so not only are the Egyptians able to have, would be starving, but they have food, but all the people around them are starving, and they're all coming to Egypt to buy food because this has all been stored up by Joseph. And among the people that show up are his own brothers, right? And the brothers show up. They don't recognize him. He plays a trick on them that he wants to sort of see where they are at this point. He sets it up so that Benjamin, they have to bring Benjamin back, and then Benjamin, they puts a little cup in Benjamin's sack of grain, and then they find it, and they're going to put Benjamin in prison. And at this point, the brothers step forward and say, don't put him in prison. My father can't stand it. He's already lost a son. He can't lose this son too. We'll stand in, or I'll stand in for, I think it's Judah who says, I'll stand in for Benjamin. Take me instead. At that point, and remember, Benjamin is Joseph's own brother by the same mother. Joseph is moved by this, and he reveals who he is to his brothers. There's a great reconciliation. We have the great line here where he says to his brothers, don't worry, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That is to say, if you hadn't sold me into slavery, I wouldn't have been here. We wouldn't have had this grain, and everybody would have died because of the famine. So here we have, again, the miraculous survival, not only with the birth of Isaac, but also now with the salvation of these people, because in the midst of the famine. Pharaoh is thrilled with, he loves Joseph, and he tells him to go up there, get his family, bring them all down, and he gives them a very good land to live on. So the Israelites all come down now. We've got the 12 tribes, the brothers, they all bring their families, their flocks, their children. They move to Egypt, where they are welcomed in. Right, so now we get to Exodus. Remember that Joseph's story has got the people, all the Israelites have been brought down to Egypt, and now we're going to get them out. They've now been enslaved. They were welcomed by the Pharaoh originally, but by this time, the Pharaoh doesn't like them anymore, scared of them. We have a number of key themes in this book that I want to lift up here. God brings the chosen people out of bondage and into freedom, into the promised land. A standard theme of this class as well. Out of bondage and into freedom. Remember, we saw the Shantung compound. We see idolatry and the kind of bondage that puts people under, and then there's a kind of freedom that comes out of faith, right? Another key theme in this is the giving of the law. Absolutely central to Judaism. The law, it's not the same as the mark, but it defines who the Jews are. These are the people of justice. These are the people who become the light to the nations, to demonstrate what God's justice looks like. The law, when they live by the law, they are God's people. We're going to see that this is what the Mosaic covenant is about. So the giving of the law. And then the third, probably most important theme here is the idea that God is battling the Pharaoh and the Pharaoh's gods by way of Moses to prove that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the one true God above all other gods. Monotheism battling against polytheism. All right, I'm not going to run through all these stories in any kind of length, just hit a couple points. Remember the women, we have the women who save Moses who would have been killed otherwise. We have the call of Moses from the burning bush and Moses's fear of taking up this calling. God's sort of empowering him to do what he needs to do. We have the 9 plagues. Most importantly, we have the 10th plague, the Passover. I do want to run through this because this is an important story. It really shows how the symbolism functions. The Passover lamb, remember, is meant to be it has to be an unblemished lamb. The people are to kill an unblemished lamb and take the blood from the lamb and mark their doors with it. So that when the angel of death passes through Egypt, the angel will pass over the houses that are marked with the blood of the unblemished lamb. All right, so what do Christians do with this? In the New Testament, we see that Jesus has the final meal, the Last Supper with his disciples just before he's killed, is a Passover meal. And at this meal, he takes the bread and he takes the wine and he passes it around and says, "This is my body, this is my blood." They would understand this. They would understand that what he's saying is that he is the new Passover lamb. He is going to become the Passover lamb. And the next day, he's crucified. Christians, there's a third level to this. And when Christians go to the table, the Eucharistic table, or to communion meal, whatever you call it, the Lord's Supper, they have a little bit of wine and a little bit of bread that they're given to eat. And the understanding is that in many ways, they are themselves being marked by the blood of the Lamb. This goes all the way back now, right? The people that marked their doors with the blood of that Lamb, and the angel of death passed over. Jesus becomes the unblemished Lamb. The body and blood of Jesus is at the communion table. When people consume this, they are themselves marked with the blood, and the angel of death passes over. So continuing on with Exodus, two more stories that I want to hit here are the crossing of the Red Sea and the giving of the law. So after the 10th plague, Pharaoh lets them go, right? We know that Pharaoh's army chases them then. Eventually, they get caught at the Red Sea. We have this great story of faith. This business of they have to choose. Are they going to walk out there or not? We also have kind of an interesting text there. On one hand, they're told to stand still and let God work through you, and also to walk forward, which is kind of, what does that mean? You stand still, let God work through you, and at the same time, be an agent and walk into that water. And so they do. And here's where you get this great line, God makes a way where there is no way. There is no way. They're stuck. They're like those Chilean miners, they're caught. But God makes a way where there is no way as long as you trust. You have to trust, right? So they trust and they go across. And for the first time, we hear that they fear God. So they come to faith. There's a kind of being born way of looking at this symbolically as the people. Couple of stories to follow, the story of the manna, the story of where God helps them. Again, hears their cries in the wilderness. The people complain all the time and continue to complain even after they come to faith. God, however, provides them with food and water. Actually, it's another story. And I stuck at that story, and I had you read the story where the two men come out and hold up Moses' arms. They're in the middle of a battle. And as long as he can hold his arms up with the staff, they're winning. But he can't hold them up himself. So two people come out and hold them up for him. It's just a great story of kind of interdependency. It reminded me of Shantung. So we then get to the mountain, and God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. Okay. It's a convoluted story. I'm not going to go through it all. You've read it. But in the long run, God really makes the covenant with the people by way of Moses, gives them the law. The 10 Commandments, the 10 means that it really stands for all laws. It's the 10 Commandments, right? 10 plagues, endless plagues, 10 laws. There are a whole bunch of laws, 600 and some laws that follow in the Bible, which we didn't look at. But these are all meant to be kind of within the 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments, they kind of protect the 10 Commandments. At any rate, we have the giving of the law. And as I already said, the giving of their identity. The first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. They immediately break when they go and they make the golden calf. Again, we have parallels here with Shantung, just to remember that for the exam. People get nervous. When they get anxious, idolatry sets in, right? We grab onto what we can grab onto. So they create the golden calf, and God is really mad. And we once again have a very similar story to when Abraham became an advocate for the people before God of Sodom. Are you really going to kill all the righteous? We have Moses here becoming an advocate for the people who have sinned. They've all fallen into idolatry, but he stands before God and says, you don't want to do this. This is not your God of justice. If you kill all these people, people are going to say what kind of God is that the Jews have? They slaughtered all the people. So you're going to want to save the people, right? He's a good lawyer here. So Moses advocates for the people, goes down, but then he punishes them, right? He smashes the tablets. Eventually he gets another set. And interestingly, there's still a very tough punishment here for having done what they did. 3,000 men are killed that day. He calls the Levites. Levi is one of the sons, so the Levites are one of the tribes, and they're going to become actually they're going to be important when they set up the temple. The Levite, that tribe, becomes the priests of the temple. At any rate, now Moses calls them and says, go back with your sword, kill everybody. You either stand with God or you stand against God. If you're against God, you're going to die. And they kill 3,000 men that day. They go on. They build the Ark of the Covenant. I did want to get that far. There are pictures of the Ark of the Covenant. I think I gave you. I think I got that far. Maybe not. At any rate, they built the Ark of the Covenant, into which they put the 2 stone tablets. And in many ways, I mean, the Ark is built as a box. It's on these 2 long poles so people can carry it through the desert. I mean, that's what they're doing. They're traveling through the desert. And in a sense, this is God. The law and God become very closely united here, right? The Ark holds this God, and they carry God with them in that sense. So that's important. It takes them 40 years to go through the Promised Land. Not 4, not 14, 40. So we have several generations out there, right? There's lots of things we could say about what it means to be in the wilderness, to be open to God, to be changed, to be whatever. The wilderness is a very interesting symbol itself. By the time they get to the Promised Land, Moses is not allowed to go in. Moses dies before they enter. But he once again says to them, you're going to live by the law, you're going to die by the law. Choose you this day, life or death. The Mosaic covenant is a conditional covenant. And Joshua is the one who leads the people into the Promised Land. He's going to cross the Jordan River, which we're going to see later on. We'll talk about this when we get to John the Baptist, who also goes back and baptizes in the Jordan River, in a sense, to bring them back in as if they were starting again, coming into the Promised Land. That's what that is about. All right, on we go. So now we come to David and the establishment of the monarchy. And at this point, we've got some real dates. As you know from the movie, archaeological data, archaeological evidence, and historical evidence suggests that David's kingdom really existed. And so I want you to start learning these dates here. BCE 1000 is not a hard date to remember. It's a simple one. David's story, of course, is in the book, the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1 book, 2 scrolls. You know those stories. You should have those stories down. I'm not going to run through them. David's second son, Solomon, remember the first son dies because of Bathsheba, because he and Bathsheba have an illicit affair, and Bathsheba's son dies. She has a second son, Solomon, who becomes a very great king as well. David is a great king. This is considered the golden age of David. He expands the kingdom. He takes the city that becomes Jerusalem, or the city of David, and his son builds Solomon's temple. Solomon is a very great king as well, very wise. He builds the temple, which is mentioned in the covenant, and I'll get to the covenant in a minute. And they're doing very well. By 930, however, we have a split, and that's not long after the temple is built. Presumably, this split is around worship differences, around how worship should take place. But then, they split. We have 10 tribes in the north, 2 in the south. David's line continues to thrive in the south. King after king, they're all in David's line. We have 200 years here. By 720, right, we have the northern kingdom, which falls to the Assyrians. Remember, they've split. And in the north, we have a very famous prophet named Amos, who is the one who talks about, he says, let justice roll down like waters. That's a phrase that many of you may have heard. Let justice roll down like waters comes from Amos. He's warning the tribes that if they don't live according to the Mosaic covenant, that they are going to be punished. And they are called to be just. They're called to live just lives according to God's law. But they don't, and so, in fact, they are overrun by the Assyrians. And we don't really know what happened to these tribes. Apparently, they probably assimilated. They probably weren't just wiped out, they probably assimilated. But at any rate, they disappear over time, right? So after this division and after they're taken by the Assyrians, the southern kingdom remains strong, and the Davidic line continues in the south. Then the temple thrives, right? So they're doing very well, and they're pretty complacent about their God, and they get a little too complacent, and then we have the problem of idolatry setting in. And Jeremiah, the prophet you read for this week, precedes the fall of the southern kingdom in 586. And Jeremiah is a wonderful example, or horrible example, of what it means to be a prophet. It's not something you would want to pick as a career. Notice at the beginning of the book, God calls Jeremiah, and Jeremiah, just like Moses did, tries to resist. He says, I can't do this. Don't ask me to do what you're asking me to do. Now, it's important to see that the Israeli prophets, the prophets of Judaism, are very different than prophets in other cultures, and there are prophets in other cultures. Other prophets look much more like the magicians in the Pharaoh's court that you saw before. The prophets in Israel are called by God to speak God's word to the people and to the kings. They can speak to power, right? Notice that by this time, God isn't speaking directly to people anymore. God does that in those earlier texts, but not now. Now God speaks to the prophets, and the prophets speak to the people. And unlike other countries where it would be less likely that a magician or a prophet would be willing to tell the king that they were making a mistake, the prophets in Israel feel they must tell the kings when they're making a mistake, when they're doing something they shouldn't do, because that's God's word. And of course, they suffer for this. And we see Jeremiah living a very, very difficult life. Why is it that the people who are righteous are suffering and the people that aren't righteous are thriving? Great question. Why do the good people die and the bad people thrive? At any rate, eventually, Jeremiah's predictions come true, and the southern kingdom falls to the Babylonians. Now, this is a real shock to them because they had thought that they were pretty safe. After all, they have the God that's the God that could beat Pharaoh's God. This is the God above all gods. They've got God in the temple. They've got the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. And, they don't take that seriously, the threat that they're going to be overrun, despite what Jeremiah tells them. But they are, and this is a terrible, devastating blow. The city is destroyed. People are killed. The temple is destroyed. The Ark of the Covenant disappears. It looks like God has abandoned them. And all the people who have any power or money are marched off as slaves to Babylon, where they will, in fact, stay for the next 45 years. But they don't know. They don't know if they've lost the promised land forever. And the first question that comes up for them is, has God actually abandoned us? Is that what's happened? And if you look in the book of Lamentations, the very last verse makes this very clear. We don't know whether God has abandoned us or not. And so they have a real theological crisis here on their hands. I mean, the other option is that the Babylonian God is stronger than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and maybe they have this wrong. Right? Now, in the end, as you know from the movie, that this period is absolutely critical. They remain in exile for about 45 years, and again, they come back in shifts. This is not all at one time that these things happen, but it's while they're in Babylon that what we think of as Judaism today is really invented. That's when this is put together. It's also when those first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah, are put together by those scholars who somehow thread together the ancient texts. They must have brought the scrolls with them when they were marched off to Babylon. So these are old stories, but remember we talked about the documentary hypothesis and the 4 different voices. These are these ancient texts that were not all written by the same person, and they're threaded together into the 5 books of Moses. And notice that the Mosaic covenant is set at the center of this. And they're called the 5 books of Moses, in part because this is how they eventually answer the theological crisis that they're in, which is, is God abandoned us, or is God not really very strong? Well, no. Here's the answer. The answer is that God is so strong that God can use the Babylonians to punish us. And why are we being punished? Because we broke the Mosaic covenant. So the first 5 books are really focused on this idea that the Mosaic covenant is central, and it's a conditional covenant. And you will pay for it if you don't live the way God intends for you to live. They're expected to be righteous people. They're expected to be a light to the nations. They're expected to bring justice. That's who they are. And so it's also the case that it's during this time that practices are established. The Sabbath keeping becomes clear, and probably circumcision. That these things are lifted up in part by the scholars who seem to be leading the people while they're in Babylon, who still maintain the community. They don't want to see the Jews assimilated into the Babylonian culture, which would be the easy thing to have happen. So, in fact, they keep telling themselves, this is who we are. We're not like the Babylonians. We are the chosen people. We have a special job to do here. And we know that we are because we have certain practices that we do. We keep the Sabbath. Absolutely. We're going to learn to keep those 10 commandments, because we now know that we'll get punished if we don't. And there's this whole kind of establishment of this people. And so when they eventually do come back, Persia conquers the Babylonians, and then the Persians send the Jews back. They do get to come back in 540. They come back determined to live differently, and they rebuild the temple and begin what's called the Second Temple period. The book of Moses, these 5 books of Moses, are read aloud, and the people are determined to keep the law. And you remember from the movie that they find loads of these small statues that look like the golden calf, these little statues that show that idolatry and polytheism is widely practiced before the exile. Which is, of course, what Jeremiah is saying. You've got to stop. Jeremiah's argument is he's worried about idolatry. And when they come back, they don't find them anymore. The archaeologists who are looking in the ground, they can date these things, right? So they see loads of these things from before the exile. After the exile, no, they're gone. So it's very clear that they come back, and they're quite different. They're determined to live according to the Mosaic covenant. All right, so a quick review of the covenants, right? Abrahamic covenant, 5 things to remember. We're going to look at these, remember, through the 3 categories: agreements between the parties, the mark, and the blessings and curses in each of the covenants. In the Abrahamic, there's really no agreement between parties because all the promises are on God's side. You'll remember that Abraham was asleep. What are the promises God makes? You will be the father of many nations. You will have descendants like the stars in the sky. And I am giving you this land, the promised land. All right. The mark of this covenant is circumcision. That's not a condition of the covenant. It's the mark. It's the covenant being reestablished, reissued for each generation. Blessings and curses, there really are no curses. It's all blessings because it's unconditional. So 5 things: father of many nations, descendants like the stars in the sky, promised land, circumcision is the mark, and it's an unconditional covenant. Mosaic covenant, 4 things to remember, and they're not quite as well written out here as they should be. But the agreements here, there are agreements. God says this is who you are, and the people say we will live the way you want us to live. So you've got 2 sides to this. The law is so important here. The 10 Commandments mean the law in general. And I do want to say just really so the first thing is to know is the content of the 10 Commandments, or the content is the law. The second thing you need to remember is how the law is understood, right? This law is understood as gift. It is something like the law and the gospel put together for Christians. Christians tend to think of the law as the way in which God breaks you down so that you're made ready to hear the promise of the gospel, the good news of Christ. In Judaism, the good news is the law. It's the thing that tells you that you're the chosen people. You're part of this family. And in this family, this is how we do things. But it both includes, it calls you in, you're part of this family. And to be part of this family, it means that you're going to live a certain way. When you're living that way, you are living as a child of God, right? So it's a gift. It's a great gift. That's the second thing to remember. The mark of this is Sabbath keeping. It's Sabbath keeping. And Sabbath keeping and circumcision are going to both be very important as we move into the intertestamental period. The blessings and curses, well, this one, the blessings and curses really matter, right? This is the conditional covenant. To keep the law means life. To break the law means death. Choose you this day, death or life. And finally, the Davidic covenant. All right, there are more covenants than just these three, but these are the three you need to know: Abrahamic, Mosaic, and Davidic. The Davidic covenant in many ways recalls the Abrahamic, but it's different. It adds things, and it's different in other ways too. 5 things to remember for the Davidic covenant, right? What are the agreements? Well, in this case, this is considered an unconditional covenant. So once again, like the Abrahamic, it's not so much 2 sides, it's really just promises on God's side. I will build you a house, and you will build me a house for a house. That's a way to remember it. And that's really 2 things, right? I'm going to build you a house, and by a house, this means a dynasty. David is going to be the beginning of a long line of kings that will go on forever, right? I will never abandon you the way I abandoned Saul. Never. You will go on forever. So that's the first thing. Second thing, you will build me a house. That's going to be the temple, God's house, right? So I'll build you a dynasty. You're going to build me a house. This is not if then. They're both part of the same gift. We're going to live together, right? You're going to build me a house right there in the middle of your world, right there in Jerusalem. And I will be like a father to you. You will be like a son. Notice this father-son language is here. So it gets picked up by the Christians. So we've got first of all these 4 things. I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. You're going to build me a house, the temple. Your dynasty is going to last forever. That's really important because it's the thing that establishes the expectation of a Messiah before Jesus is born. It's based on this covenant. Okay. 4th thing is, I will be like a father to you. He's talking to David, and you will be my son, that father-son language. There is no mark of this covenant, I think, because it repeats in many ways the Abrahamic, right? So the circumcision remains the mark. Blessings and curses, it's an unconditional covenant, not an if-then. So again, like the Abrahamic, there's no curse associated with this that we can see. Though, by the time we get to the Davidic covenant, of course, the Mosaic covenant is part of their understanding of who they are. So the Mosaic covenant still adds a kind of, there's a conditional aspect. If you mess up too much, God will get mad at you. But this covenant feels much more like the Abrahamic than it does like the Mosaic. And that's where I'm going to stop for now. All right. So this is long. I know, longer than I wanted it to be, but I think it's got most of the information you need here. It's a good overview for the exam.